Aloha and welcome to the first Third Thursday event of 2022. And yes, we do realize it's actually the fourth Thursday, so great of those of you who caught that. This just happened to be the best time for our team. So thanks for joining today. My name is Lily, and I'm the Assistant Director for Training, Projects, and Research at the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center at the University of Hawaii. The center is led by Dr. Carl Kim, and our center is a congressionally authorized center that delivers FEMA certified training on natural hazards awareness and management to emergency managers, first responders, state and local government, NGOs, universities, small business owners, and others focused on community resilience. This series is meant for highlighting the latest in research and practice in disaster management and disaster risk reduction. And we use this monthly platform to spotlight the work that our center and our partners are doing to contribute to the field. So here's how today's going to work. First, today's discussion will be recorded for archival purposes. So if you're uncomfortable with that, please let us know. But this is going to be posted on YouTube and shared with our partners so that everyone can participate, even if asynchronously. Second, we will begin with individual presentations by our panelists, followed by Q&A and discussion. And then throughout the entire event, we welcome your participation at any point during the panel and ask that you use the Zoom chat and hand raise features if you have any comments or questions. But before jumping in, I would like to pass the mic to Professor Carl Kim to say a few words.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. It's great to see you all. I wish we were meeting in person, but we're still largely meeting online. We're starting to resume things, and even though this is our fourth Thursday, not our third Thursday, we think it's really great to connect this way. We have a great program for today, and you know, we do these monthly meetings to check in with everyone across the country. And so one of the things you can do is you can enter in the comments section there or the chat section where you're coming from, because it's hard to see this all at once. I see we have about 55 people on right now. So we gather once a month to check in with each other, to wear our black NDPTC shirts, and then to share information and celebrate some of our accomplishments. So one of the things that I did want to announce too is that we have two of our employees who are going to be recognized today for 10 years of dedicated service to our center. And that's Lydia Morikawa and Kalani Souza. We've generated plaques, and ordinarily we'd be, you know, sharing these in person. We're doing it virtually for now. I think the certificates are being mailed to your homes. But I did want to, on the behalf of the center, thank both Lydia and Kalani for their many years of service with NDPTC and as part of the research corporation of the University of Hawaii. So please join me in congratulating them for their hard work and their dedication to our center. And I think we have a really important topic to cover today. Actually, Lily's going to introduce our speakers, but I did want to acknowledge my good friend and colleague, Lonnie Lawson, who is the head of the Rural Domestic Preparedness Consortium, which is really part of the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium. And Lonnie's group really focuses on rural communities and at-risk communities, tribal communities, many of the communities that we also work with as well too. And so I did want to welcome Lonnie and his team from Kentucky to this meeting. But thank you, Lonnie, for joining us. And
thank you
so,
much.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And then also, it's also great to see David Roueche from Auburn University, who we've collaborated with on some other works related to our rapid damage assessment. And so, but thank you. And then of course our weather guy too, for joining us as well too. It's really good to see you all. And so I'll turn this over to Lily, because I know Lily prepared an introduction for today's session. Lily?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carl. So without further ado, today's third Thursday topic focuses on the December 2021 tornado outbreak in Eastern Kentucky. Over 50 tornadoes were reported, along with wind and hail across several states. The outbreak caused multiple fatalities and casualties, and emergency declarations were issued in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Our guest panelists today will share their experiences from their work on the outbreak, and I'll be introducing them now in the order that they're going to be speaking. So first off, we have Rob Dale, who's one of NDPTC's fan favorite instructors and currently teaches 6 of our courses. He's currently the owner and operator of Skywatch services, and he's been a TV and radio meteorologist for over 20 years, and has also been working in county emergency management for the past decade. His radio work broadcasts to over 25 stations across Michigan, Ohio, Arkansas, and Canada. We also have Dr. David Roueche, who is a wind engineer, civil environmental engineering, and professor at Auburn University, and the Structural Engineering Extreme Events Reconnaissance, or STEER, Associate Director for Data Standards. He was also featured on NPR, National Public Radio, to provide guidance on how to reduce the loss of life when tornadoes strike mobile homes. Then we have Lonnie Lawson, the president and CEO at the Center for Rural Development. The center's programs and services center around 4 focus areas: public safety, arts and culture, leadership, and technology. And last but not least, we have Jim Garrett, who's the volunteer and donation services coordinator for the Kentucky Department of Emergency Management, with responsibilities to promote and coordinate volunteer services and programs with local community organizations, state agencies, and nonprofit organizations. So we're going to start with Rob, who's going to walk us through the forecasts and event summary of the tornado outbreak in December of 2021. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. Just going to go over briefly what went on ahead of the event. This was a very well forecasted event. Nonetheless, lives were lost that day. And so not going to get too deep in the meteorology. I know many talks are going to come on that. I'm just impressed at how well the overall event went compared to how it could have been. You know, if this were 20, 30 years ago, I think the numbers would have been much worse. But unfortunately, we will start with the death count. 2021 was a relatively quiet year death-wise. This is a death by event until this occurred. You can see just for the most part 1, 3, 6 deaths, and then December was a tragic month all around. If you see those columns there, column A is deaths that occurred inside of a tornado watch. D was outside of a watch. So out of all the deaths that occurred last year, 98 deaths occurred inside of a tornado watch. So not saying that a watch is an end all, but it's very impressive to have 98.5% of all deaths that occurred in an area where the Storm Prediction Center says there's a high risk of tornadoes. So fascinating that the overall success was good, but nonetheless, one life lost to weather is one too many. Again, not getting into details, but 7 days, 8 days in advance of this, there was talk of something happening in the Midwest. Now, we certainly weren't talking about Kentucky getting hit by major tornadoes, but for the emergency managers, for the partners, there was information a week in advance saying, pay attention, because this could be a significant day. So 3 days out, or basically Wednesday afternoon, there was a slight threat, basically level 2 on the scale of 1 to 5 indicated for the approximate area. The day before, they upgraded it just a bit. So what's called an enhanced area, so level 3 on a 1 to 5 scale. And then finally, the day of, it was escalated to a level 4. It never made it to 5. There's some, it's even when this was getting ready to occur, we weren't sure how strong it was going to be, how widespread. There were a lot of questions. December is not a typical level 5 month. to have. Nonetheless, the overall impact was this was very well forecast in advance. Just a quick setup picture. What we had was a warm front that moved up through the Midwest, up through Illinois and Indiana. Again, this is mid-December, and we're bringing 50s and 60s into Ohio. Had some significant snows on the north side of it. That orange little scalp, that's a dry line that it was shows where the moisture contrast is, and that was one of the big determinants. It wasn't really the cold front itself that kicked off these thunderstorms. Just a quick geeky thing. This is what's called a significant tornado parameter. Anything greater than 1 gives us pause. If we're talking 2 or 3, and then we're really concerned, this was in excess of 5. So very, very high on, especially again, we reemphasize tornado season lasts all year long, but to have it in December, the public is just not ready for that. And so to have this high of a number in December is just a setup for a bad day, no matter how good the forecasts are. 1 o'clock that afternoon, these are what's called a mesoscale convective discussion. They're kind of internal weather stuff, but you're going to see them become a little more public as we modify them down the road, as in between a watch and a warning. But nonetheless, by 1 o'clock, there was already an outlook of saying the risk of supercells to produce severe hail and tornadoes later on that afternoon. Around 5 o'clock, another one was issued. That's the concern was now we're seeing that Storm Prediction Center says strong and sustained tornadoes. So not only will they be here, but once they hit the ground, they're going to keep running. And that was issued at 6 o'clock. At 7 o'clock, more updates that's saying violent tornado. It's not a word we like to see in this weather industry. So violent tornado expected to continue. 8 o'clock, we're talking about the tornado now as it's moving into Kentucky. Intense tornado threat continues. So the Storm Prediction Center did a great job of this. Detailed information updates that were great for the partners, but really good for meteorologists who could prepare some warning issues in advance. Just a quick radar, again, geeky stuff, but the upper left is showing the reflectivity, the intensity of the returns. It's showing actually debris in the clouds. The lower left is the rotation product. So we're seeing debris from a storm damage. This is the one that hit Amazon. So in the circled areas, you're seeing debris from the Amazon facility in Edwardsville. Here's a quick loop. We'll just watch it go as it moves on through the Kentucky area. So we're seeing rotation on the right. Again, if you don't understand it, that's okay. On the left, we're seeing those pinks and purples as it hits Mayfield here. We're actually seeing debris being picked up thousands and thousands of feet into the atmosphere at a very high level. So all the indications are of some very strong storms. That technology did wonders in providing alert and warning information to the meteorologists. This is a satellite loop of everything, so we're watching the clouds go through, but those colors are lightning flashes. So it's recognizing lightning in the clouds. You can see the extent from Ohio all the way down to the Gulf Coast. You can even see some lightning in the snow that occurred through Wisconsin and Michigan. So just an intense system all around, but again, the forecasts were probably about as good as we could ever be. Here's a radar time lapse that shows for 8 hours, the thunderstorm itself was moving through. So this storm started in central Arkansas early in the afternoon and did not stop until it passed Louisville, Kentucky at 1 a.m. the next morning. So the tornado itself was not on the ground that whole time, but the thunderstorm that produced it literally lasted almost 8 hours long. How did it compare to what we saw? These are the actual storm reports from that day. So anything in red is a tornado. We see the red tornado move through Kentucky is indicated. Just about everything except for that. I'm not sure what that tornado is in the green there outside the spots, but nonetheless, all the big stuff hit pretty much exactly where the Storm Prediction Center said it would be. The year overall, I showed you earlier how deaths were down until the end of the year. Tornadoes were down. The gray line shows what a normal year looks like. The red line shows what 2021 did. So it was well below normal most of the year until December. So the December being so high brought it back to what's considered a normal year. So that's my summary. Again, just didn't want to get too detailed, but wanted to show you how overall the forecast really did save lives that day. There's no doubt that even though we did lose dozens of lives, there's no question it would have been many, many more without great forecasting by the Weather Service and all of our partners.
Thank you so much, Rob. I hope that if you have any questions for Rob, you'll feel free to post them in the chat, and Rob, maybe you can address any questions in real time, and then we'll hold for the larger Q&A at the end. So now we are going to have Dr. David Roueche who's going to be talking to us about STEER's response strategy, data collection efforts, data availability, and a few observations and findings from their work.
Awesome. Thank you, Lily. So as she mentioned, I'll present an overview of STEER's response, and I'll just mention here I'm presenting, of course, on behalf of the entire STEER leadership team, and then also specifically the field response team. Here. So if you're not familiar with STEER, STEER stands for Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance and Network. Our mission is to conduct and build the capacity for impactful post-hazard structural reconnaissance. We was formed, sort of piloted, I guess, in 2018 with the National Science Foundation Eager Award, and then renewed in 2021 as a 3-year award, and hopefully we'll go extend beyond that as well. So it's composed of a 5-person board of directors, of which I'm just one of the members. And then we also have a 15-member hazard advisory board, and then over 300 members of STEER, engineers, hazard engineers across academia, industry, federal labs, and other organizations. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about STEER, I'd encourage you to go to the website, our website there. We have a list of all of our past responses and products and resources, reports, et cetera, that may be useful to you. But with that, let me get into our response to the event itself. And I'll mention in doing so that our efforts primarily focused on what I'll call the Mayfield tornado. And then we briefly were able to get down to the tornado that struck Bowling Green. Here's sort of a timeline of our response. On the 10th, 11th, when everything happened, we activated on that same day with our virtual response team and what we call a VAST. And with that, we began collecting sort of online information as much as we could to try to understand the impacts that then fed into our field teams. And the field teams traveled to the site on the 13th and then spent 14th, 15th, and 16th conducting assessments across Mayfield, Princeton, Dawson Springs, Bowling Green, et cetera, out in those areas. Returned, and then we published our reconnaissance report on the 28th. Summarizing our observations and findings and the data that we collected. And then we're working vigorously now on curating all of that data, which will be published to the National Science Foundation's Design Safe platform, where it's publicly available for anyone to use and reuse as they see fit. So just going into a little bit more detail there on our response strategy. Again, the virtual assessment teams were activated first and using social media, early news reports, FEMA, anything that we could to sort of gather intel on what was happening and what areas were impacted most. And that began informing our on-site deployment strategy. So then our field teams, again, activated on the 13th, and we deployed a range of technologies that is fairly standard to our responses now. So it included what we call surface level panoramas, which is essentially street view collections throughout some of these key impacted municipalities. We were also able to get up a couple of UAVs in downtown Mayfield and Buena Vista. That was a bit of more of a challenge than we thought, just due to how soon we were there after the event. There was still search and rescue going on. And so we understandably did not want to get in the way of that. But we did have a window of time between when that was lifted and when the presidential visits and all the shutdowns associated with that came to be able to get some good imagery there. And then we also did some targeted what we call door-to-door performance assessments. So teams going on-site, door-to-door, collecting some of the structural details that are important to understanding not just what happened, but why structures performed as they did. And that included a couple of really detailed case studies where we use LiDAR and some other more in-depth data collection techniques. For example, the Mayfield water tower, a couple of fire stations, et cetera. And then we issued our joint report on the 28th. So in terms of the data that we collected, a quick high-level summary here. So 154 door-to-door performance assessments, 49 what we'll call street view routes covering 81 kilometers throughout the region. And then again, UAS was a little bit limited just by some of the regulations that were in place at the time, but we did get 2 3D sites and then also basically an aerial panoramic tour of downtown Mayfield as well. And then 36 LiDAR scans as well that allow us to reconstruct some of these failures in more detail. All right, so to give you an idea of the street view coverage, this is our routes through, again, Mayfield, Buena Vista, Princeton, Dawson Springs, Bremen, and Bowling Green. So trying to capture as much of these areas as possible just a few days after the tornado happened, before a whole lot of cleanup had occurred. And so some of that data may be certainly useful to others. And so we've published it to the Mapillary platform, which is public, openly available to anyone. You can click the link there, or I have all the links summarized at the end of the presentation here, and I'll be happy to share that with the team afterwards. So here's just an example, some of the street view imagery through downtown Mayfield. This is, again, hosted on the Mapillary platform for now, but all the imagery will also be published to Design Safe. This is the aerial tour, if you will, through downtown Mayfield. Right now, this is just hosted on a personal website through the university, but it allows you to sort of jump from each of these from one point to another and get a 360 view of the impacts. And structurally, this allows us to see what's destroyed, what's still standing, and look at both successes and failures and have a more holistic or contextual view of the building performance. So before I get into a couple of observations, I just wanted to present what I think are some important key engineering context to these impacts. The first is that the design wind speeds in Kentucky, as is similar for most of the interior of the US, is 115 miles an hour for typical structures. And for critical facilities, it bumps up to 120 miles an hour. So that's what we're designing to withstand. So when you look at something like the EF4 Mayfield tornado, where the National Weather Service estimated the maximum wind speeds are about 190 miles an hour, that's going to produce wind loads that are actually the wind speed ratio squared. Okay, there's a squared relationships there, so it's actually 2.5 times greater than what the modern sort of code compliant buildings were designed to withstand. So that's obviously one of the reasons we see such destruction in tornadoes like this. But the silver lining to that, to some degree, is that typically that 190 mile an hour, max wind speeds, or that EF4 level wind speeds, typically only occurs over a very small portion of the tornado path. There's been studies in the past that I've been a part of, as well as some others, that have shown that about 90% of the damage path in these violent tornadoes typically experience wind speeds less than the EF2 level, or less than 135 miles an hour. So there's potential to shrink the damage path considerably with some improved construction requirements and so on, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The other sort of just noteworthy item here related to storm shelters were that the regulations were added to the Kentucky Building Code in 2012, but they were voluntary then, and it wasn't until 2015 that they were mandated for schools, at least with occupancies greater than 50. So that ties into, again, that ultimate life safety objective in some of these extreme events. So with that, just a couple of quick observations. I would point you, of course, to our report for some more detailed a summary of those. But in wood frame residential performance, obviously most of the buildings that we encounter are just that, wood frame and residential. And as would be expected for a region like this, again, interior portion of the US, not designing to a wind speed that's very high. I mentioned earlier, we designed to 115 miles an hour here in the interior of the US. You get closer to the coast, and it can be anywhere from 140 to 180 miles an hour, depending upon where you are, just for some context there. So most of the structures that we investigated did not really have any meaningful wind uplift resistance. You've got buildings that are just sitting on unreinforced masonry piers, or just sort of these stem wall foundations, no real positive connections between that, just relying upon the weight of the structure really to hold it in place. That was very common. In the cases where we did see some hurricane straps or other, wind uplift hardware, anchor bolts even, they were generally isolated points of strength in what was otherwise a very weak load path. And so, in a case like this shown in the bottom right, this multifamily structure did have hurricane straps tying the trusses to the walls. However, the straps only, there's basically a failure mechanism between the top plates of the wall, and that may not mean much if you're not familiar with that type of construction. But basically, it was the hurricane strap is a stronger method of construction, but there was another glaring sort of weak point just below the hurricane strap in the load path, and so it simply just changes the failure mechanism. And so we saw that quite a bit. However, there were some anecdotal success stories. So This was one that we thought was interesting. This is right by the collapsed water tower, and this was a retrofitted structure that obviously still sustained some damage, but it was mostly building envelope damage. Surrounding buildings to this all had major structural damage up to a complete collapse, and yet this structure still had the roof attached, sheathing there. And when we looked, you could see metal straps that wrapped completely around the truss, and then further down in the wall, tying all of that connection together with a metal strap, and seemed to produce a much better performance relative to the surroundings. So even in an EF4 tornado, this was very near the center of the path, just downwind of the collapsed water tower, and we see a residential building that's able to still be standing, and it would have been a safe shelter. Some other just quick highlights. The high variability in performance we see quite often in tornadoes, and no difference here, where you have, for example, these apartment buildings, and you have some that are completely collapsed, like up here in the top right, walls completely collapsed, a lot of the debris gone, and just across the street, with the tornadoes moving this direction, you have buildings that are still standing. And some of that is, I wish I had better answers for all of them. Some of them seem to be tied to orientation, but I think a lot of them are just indicative of how the damage can progress very quickly once you lose one critical element. So once the roof comes off, the rest of it goes very quickly, and it looks a lot more catastrophic than it would be otherwise. Whereas if you can maintain the integrity of the roof, it helps hold everything else together as well. So you see this very disparate damage in close proximity. Something like the Kentucky Agriculture Center of Excellence as well. You may be familiar with that. Multiple new and old sections of the building collapsed. And my question sort of to us as a community here is that acceptable performance? Obviously, this is an EF4 tornado, 190 miles an hour or so. And we're designing these buildings to 115, 120. So we expected to fail, but is that acceptable or not? Do we want it to be better than that? There's certainly things that can be done if we're willing to make the investment. So just some quick closing thoughts here. Obviously, as tragic as the impacts were, and they certainly were tragic in every sense, from a purely engineering perspective, the damage is not unexpected, but it's also not inevitable. We can do better, as some of those success stories have shown. But we need to change the paradigm. We got to start shifting the focus off of just meeting the current code minimums, which do not consider tornadoes at all, to meeting what we call a dual objective performance goals, which is one, minimize the damage in the EF2 or lower wind speeds. That's very doable, and it's very cost effective to do. But then objective two is to protect life safety in these sort of very extreme EF3 plus wind speeds. So maintaining, focusing on that dual objective performance goals, as opposed to saying, well, I meet code, when code is a very minimum standard that really does not address tornado safety or tornado damage at all. And then lastly here, the latest engineering wind design standard, ASE 722, there has been some progress there, where for the first time it explicitly considers tornadoes in the minimum design loads. And so there's some impetus there, there's some, I guess, some momentum there. And if we can leverage that and start building back to better standards, we can start to see improved performance in the future. So with that, I would like to just acknowledge and list all of the other team members who are part of the deployment, and then as well as those who assisted virtually. Certainly appreciate all of their help, as well as the support of the National Science Foundation for STEER. And then lastly, I'll leave this up here just as my closing slide. And again, I'm happy to share this presentation, but these are just links to all the different data sets that are available now. And then again, the complete data set will be available on Design Safe, hopefully in March. So that is all that I have.
Thank you so much, David. That was extremely informative. And we do have a copy of your slides. And if that's okay with you, we'd love to share that with our participants so they can access some of these resources that you're pointing to.
Yep, happy to.
Wonderful. All right, next up, we've got Lonnie, who's going to be telling us a little bit about the Center for Rural Development, the RDPC.
Thank you, Lily. And I want to thank Carl for the opportunity to be a part of this as well. I want to talk a little bit about RDPC, but I want to save most of the time for Jim, because Jim has the real crux of what has gone on in Kentucky and what is still going on in Kentucky. So this is obviously a devastating storm, no question. I think I saw on the news this morning that the death toll was up to 80 now on this event, but I'm sure Jim will share that kind of information. Who is RDPC? Who's the Center for Rural Development? We're actually the host agency for the Rural Domestic Preparedness Consortium based in Kentucky. We have 5 other partners that is part of the RDPC: Eastern Kentucky University, Northwest Arkansas Community College, University of Findlay in Ohio, North Carolina Central University. They're our only HBCU institution, University of California, Davis, and University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Each of them bring expertise to the consortium and have training courses that, our mission is to really to provide training to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And this one is obviously a tough one to recover from, but that's all, it's long been one of my pet issues is how do we do a better job of responding, once the event's over and the FEMA folks have gone on, or whomever else that responded and have come in and done their work, then there's a long economic recovery. And how do we do a better job of that? I will tell you that I think this is one of the better responses, one of the better recovery efforts that I have seen in a long time. And I hope Jim will take some credit for that because they have done a fabulous job. We have a cadre of courses that range all the way across the spectrum from business continuity to mass fatalities to functional needs and disabilities preparation, emergency operations plan. So you can find all of our courses at ruraltraining.org. Love to give you more information when it's possible, but I'm going to leave the rest of my time for Jim. Jim Garrett is with Kentucky Emergency Management, and he does a fabulous job in Kentucky. He knows who RDPC is. So Lily, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
That's perfect. All yours, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Lily. Good to see everyone. And thank you for all of your care and concern for us in Kentucky and the work that you've done for us. This disaster event was one of a series that I'll be talking about that we've had over the last 2 months as we've responded to multiple events and really appreciate everything that folks are doing to support us. I want to start first with talking about the context of this, and actually great thanks to our colleagues from National Weather Service. As Rob has said, they were on it, and they were really on it for us. But this pattern had some warnings to it earlier than what Rob had talked about. Just to remind some of my colleagues that, and I do this around our offices where I sit in the recovery section at Kentucky Emergency Management. We had a small tornado, some severe weather earlier that same week. Of course, the tornadoes happened on a Friday. That Tuesday, in Scott County, Kentucky, we had a EF0, maybe an EF1 that hit the proverbial trailer home park and actually overturned 25 homes. And then again, that's north of Lexington, but it reminded me of our tornado outbreak that we had March 2nd, 2012. That again, in that week, in 2012, we had a small outbreak earlier in the week and then unstable air mass that led to a further outbreak, and coincidentally also on a Friday. So same kind of pattern. But Ricky, if you got the slides up, if we could go to the warning slide that we had, again, with our weather partners that were telling us all week to be ready, to be prepared. I remember well that Friday afternoon, December 10th, when we went from enhanced state 3 to 4, and we knew that something was going to happen. And many of my comments now are not as scientific as David and Rob, but maybe more in the social sciences and what we were doing and looking at. And so this shows you the warnings we had at 2 a.m. Now, a little bit with this, and you may not see the outline as well in the States, but down there in the bottom left-hand corner, That's Arkansas and Missouri and coming through Tennessee that gave us this historic proportion tornado that we've heard mentioned many times, is that historic tornado from Quad State to the length of time in which the storm was happening to where it was actually the main tornado was on the ground. But these warnings give you an indication of what was happening overnight for us. That you see the length coming up out of our neighboring states. Again, Arkansas, the Boot Heel of Missouri, Tennessee, and into Kentucky. Rob mentioned that the storms had gone all the way up through Louisville, that top right area there, and indeed it was the case. For us in Kentucky, we will be seeing maps of 2 main tornado tracks, but for us in that night, we had at least 26 confirmed tornadoes in Kentucky. And I think just about every Kentuckian, because of the storms, had spent some time in their basements. And hopefully if they weren't, they were moving towards their basements throughout the entire Commonwealth, except for the far eastern Kentucky. People will talk about the storms that night. And so it was a severe weather night. What you see in these storm warnings too, that point out as we come out, and you'll see in other slides, you see that main storm warning area, where everything's grouped together. And then below it, smaller warnings, but that was another significant track. So what we hear oftentimes in the news is, some towns that you've heard mentioned with Dave, Mayfield, Dawson Springs, and Bowling Green. I mentioned that now, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but that lower track is the tornado that got Bowling Green and the city of Bowling Green and everything in between. So quite a bit of activity that night as we look at it. What I'll do in some of my talk in limited time as we get into questions is to just highlight and bullet point some things from that we can come back to and talk, but just to keep things moving from this and from the warnings, a couple of bullet points that we knew. One of the things is the geographic spread for us, the length of this tornado. So we knew that a challenge that would be coming is how to capture, again, the impacts, the damage, and even the response. It's similar to maybe a hurricane, a large hurricane on the Gulf Coast, and when we talk about hundreds of miles. And so for us, it was a couple hundred miles. These days, even as we have people responding and planning recovery work, they'll talk about, well, we'd like to go to this town and that town and not realize that there's 4 or 5 hours driving time between the towns. So geographic spread is a challenge that has come with this tornado, this tornado outbreak. The other challenge that we had on that particular night was indeed that it was at nighttime. And so even the first response efforts and those first response of saving lives, starting that initial rescue was done in dark, and so many reports coming out, well, we'll get a better look at this when the sun comes up. So a lot of work going in nighttime after tornado outbreak were the first couple of challenges that we had that evening. And Ricky, if we could go to the next slide, we'll show you what's happened from the warnings, and we're jumping ahead now a little bit just to give you again some of the numbers. Through this and the Fema Declaration, which by the way, we have to say came very, very quickly. The declaration was of course an emergency declaration was made by around noontime Eastern on the 11th, so the day after, and then we had our major declaration, presidential declaration, on Sunday the 12th. One of the significant things that we look at in that declaration is that because of the severity of the damage and what was being seen on TV, I think was a big help in getting those declarations. We did it without damage assessments. And those of you who are in emergency management know it's the PDAs and then the joint PDAs. All of that was off the table. We had our major declaration and then add-on counties within 2 or 3 other days, almost to the point where we were doing damage assessments, but the teams were called back because we had gotten additional declarations at our request for the add-on counties, and they were added on. So from this, we have 16 counties that were at IA, you see those kind of in the purple, and you see the grid on the right, and then 23 public assistance declarations. I will say, you can see in these tornado tracks and patterns, one of the challenges that we have are, of course, is always the undeclared counties, that have damage in them. We are working to make sure that they're not overlooked, that they are getting the care and response that they need as well. But you see those two major tracks that we have had. One of the things I want to say too with the tracks, and one of the challenges for us in Kentucky, is that even though we are disaster prone and we are quite accustomed to disasters and disaster outbreaks, our major outbreak is flooding followed by wind damage. Tornadoes are not unheard of by any stretch of the imagination in Kentucky. However, tornadoes of this scale are new to us. And so this is part of our historic too with these things. And with, another historic part for us with the declarations is the number of individual assistance registrations that we have. The number of registrations today is we're at 15,716. And again, for some areas, Gulf Coast states, other places, those kinds of numbers may seem small. But for us, it is our largest historic individual assistance declaration. I will say one thing with all of this too that we're learning and looking at in our response is that while it's the most impactful event that we've had in Kentucky, we're still reminding ourselves it's manageable. And that's been a word of hope in what we use in our title, in emergency management. It's management and it's manageable, and we're finding those resources that are coming. The other thing that happened with the event that actually came as good things that we saw right away that are helpful in a response and a faster response is that you saw in David's presentation some of the critical infrastructure buildings that were impacted. The water tower, that was one of those graphic iconic images from Mayfield, the city of Mayfield. The county courthouse in Mayfield, another county courthouses. We lost a number of fire stations, small volunteer stations for the most part, but even in Graves County, Mayfield, that was the center of media attention. We did lose the emergency services building, where they did all their public protection, the police, fire, and emergency management. So one of those challenges we have was the backup plans. Where do we go? Where do we have our seat of government now that those buildings were lost? But the good news through all of this tragedy is that in those critical infrastructure buildings, we didn't lose any hospitals, we didn't lose any schools. And so there's, at least we had that backup, or we didn't have backup. We had hospitals that were open and could treat patients. And we also had schools open. Now, with that said, though, and I'll come back to this a couple of times, is the dating of this on December 10th and 11th. Schools decided in most of the impact counties to go ahead and close. Winter break was coming soon anyhow. And with the damages, we did close schools, and they reopened. Some of them right on time after their planned winter break. Others were opened soon after, just a couple more day delays, but we got schools opened again. And I think that certainly helps with our recovery. So the response had to start. I mean, we see some of these numbers. I've jumped ahead a little bit, but just some other numbers, and those of you in emergency management, one of those things that are 3,000 homes are destroyed or major damaged. We are now up to 80 fatalities. We were at 77 for a while. We were 79 for a long time, but we just went up to 80 this past week with one person one person who was hospitalized for a long period of time did die recently. So we are at 80 deaths in Kentucky. 123,000 homes were left without power. The good news is that we were able to get power restored quickly. Our electric companies did a great job in getting the power restored. It took a little bit longer in downtown Mayfield, but then again, everything was destroyed and the buildings weren't functioning anyhow, and nobody was living there and moved, so that wasn't as bad. Of course, roads and lifelines were blocked by debris and power lines, so we had to get those opened very quickly. We did turn to partners that were very helpful in our response. Immediately, it was urban search and rescue. We have two teams that were deployed from elsewhere in Kentucky that came in, and we had 4 federal urban search and rescue teams that came in from Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, and Missouri. And so great thanks to that help. I will say too, we did use EMAC requests and invited partners with coming in from 9 states and 47 other persons from emergency management programs, and we're in great gratitude to them. A challenge though that we had to mention, and we think about this in planning, even in the search and rescue that started right away. I'm sure you heard and saw the reports of that candle factory, which was a great concern to us, even at the night when we first heard at the State Emergency Operations Center that there was a candle factory destroyed, that it was full work shift overnight, that was there, not knowing how many deaths would be there. But one of the challenges we had, and they said it was taking too long, you know, of course, folks who were waiting for word of family members who were in that rubble and debris. The challenge that we had is that even with the dogs that were deployed, is when you think about a candle factory, think about how many candles are scented, and we buy scented candles, and the scents were a big problem. So, you know, that we're in the factory, and the dogs were a bit confused by all the scents. Just something a learning right there. One of the things that I will say with the candle factory and some of the reports you may have seen, and I want to go back to the warning systems that we had in place. Clearly, the Weather Service, excellent job. I mean, just spot on, and we can't say enough about where we've come in weather predictions and what's happening through the Storm Prediction Center. And of course, all the warnings that went out with the Weather Service, the warnings we did through technology with reverse 911 and everything else. But I also must add that in these days of social media, personal texts, things like that, as the storms were tracking through Kentucky, people just texting one another as well, and warnings going out. You know, that one of the advantages we had in Mayfield in Graves County, that's down on the left of this slide. It's that second kind of area that's purple. It's that rectangle, that's Graves County and Mayfield, when the storms were coming up out of Missouri. Oh, thank you, Ricky. When the storms were coming from Missouri and from Tennessee, first hit Fulton and Hickman counties, the first 2 counties in Kentucky, people were texting into Mayfield. And so that social media power is something we want to look at, as people were giving warnings to each other. We've had tornadoes here, they're coming your way, was part of that great warning system that we have to look at. So we see the numbers. One of the advantages we had, and I think that was helpful to us in our response and recovery that was moving very fast, is that this severe weather outbreak was followed by good weather. We had 6 or 7 days of above high temperatures, warmer temperatures for us, and sunshine. So we could really get to work. And when, again, with good weather reporting, when we knew the first storms and rains were coming in on December 18th, you know, we were pushing hard. We were pushing the volunteer organizations that were trying to do some help, especially in the preservation of property, you know, getting tarps up, if, you know, on roofs, to get all that done, work as fast as you can, as hard as you can, as safe as you can. But those days of good weather that we had were days of blessings, actually, where we could work. We'll say that even in those days, the challenges that we had, and for us in Kentucky, this was our first major international event that we've had in terms of international media, national media, and all that meant. I do work in volunteer donations and individual assistance. So I do need to mention volunteers and donations, and especially donations and all the planning around those. We got way too much things that we didn't ask for, and it kept coming. And it was a major and significant problem for us and a challenge everywhere, with trucks and supplies and spontaneous volunteers showing up and clogging up the system, and still clogged up. We're spending a great deal of money on warehousing for unwanted and unsolicited donations. So that has to be part of our planning. Well, one thing I wanted to mention that we're going through, if we look at the next slide, that we had, even though we had those good days of weather, one thing that we may have missed, and not as much in the news, but we had another tornado outbreak on January 1st. So Happy New Year to us in Kentucky. 10 confirmed tornadoes that day, but these storms also came with a lot more rain and precipitation than the storms in December 10th and 11th. So I need to mention them as another challenge that we've had. And that is another outbreak with lots of flooding. We still have a disaster declaration waiting for a decision from the January 1st storms that would add a couple more counties to the individual assistance, or actually new declaration, but some of the counties that were impacted earlier may be in that declaration. And then in Eastern Kentucky, to the right of where we are on these maps and showing that outbreak, there was significant flooding. And so we have counties waiting for a decision for a declaration from flooding. And in addition to that, and challenges we've had, we actually, in 2 months, in December and January, have had 4 states of emergency by our governor because of winter events. It is winter. So we've had ice storm and snow events that have been added on. And even today, we have flooding and ice in Kentucky. So ongoing events, but we have been able to move ahead. Oh, and by the way, I do need to mention that all of this was happening during Omicron and the COVID and pandemic and that outbreak. So we were dealing with that as well. So lots of things were going on, but a couple challenges that we have that were ongoing is that a lot of agricultural damage, and so as we're looking at PA and IA, public assistance, individual assistance declaration, of course, all the support that comes from SBA, of course, USDA declarations, is the particular agricultural communities. We are very much an agricultural state, and so we're looking at those impacts. I did want to mention, as I want to finish up and have time for questions, that on the PA side, I did mention 23 counties. We have in the neighborhood of 150 eligible applicants for public assistance now. We have 7, we'll end up with between 700 to 1,000 public worksheets submitted with an estimated value. Right now, we're still waiting for insurance and stuff, but on the PA side, could be between $250 to $400 million in damages. One of the advantages we had is that we are 100% federal pay on this. There's not a cost share. That's still continuing through and possibly through until April. So a big opportunity for us. I'll leave this with 4 learnings that I've had and seen that we can look at, and you may see that. One, I was amazed at the number of contractors, private contracting companies that have swooped in, getting into our county, saying, here's something I can offer to you. In fact, when we were going out and doing our assessments, when we did, and starting to do our work, it was amazing the number of contracting companies that were out there looking for work. I know in society, we used to make jokes about, and sorry if I'm offensive here in any way, but ambulance chasing lawyers. Yes, there is a lot of business to disaster now. Something I've seen, and I don't know if it's a new phenomena, the amazing number of contractors looking for business. And even in my area, in individual assistance, I was amazed by that. The other learning is again, the whole community response, now looking at recovery in the community and bringing the community together, something we did learn, and I think is a continuing learning in other disasters, other places, is an understanding of the social service needs that exist in the community. And then what happens with housing stock, who owns the housing availability, what's not there before a disaster, what happens after a disaster. So indeed, a great focus needs to be put on understanding housing any day in any of our communities and what that could mean in a disaster event like this. And then the desire, people that wanted to help, and even you know, in the emergency management community, the numbers of people that wanted to come help out was certainly appreciated, but the jamming up of our phone lines by well-intentioned persons offering, I can come with my search and rescue team, you know, from government to government. We need to remember how we work and how we request, and not jam up the system along with the volunteer donations calls as well. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that I haven't said and will not say ever, I told you so, to our county emergency managers, you know, and thinking about what can happen here. But I have said a few times, and will continue to say, you know, this challenge that you have was covered in that training class by RDPC. And we need, and I say that somewhat seriously, and I have said that to people in the other training class, but I think for all of us, we need to take our training seriously and make sure we apply it and have our plans based on the training and experiences from our scientific and academic communities. And with that, I'll stop and just with a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to all of our panelists for just wonderful presentations that cover such a breadth of knowledge about this outbreak event. I do think we have time for one question, and so Everett posted one that I think is relevant to all of the speakers today. And the question is, what were the challenges in response, and I'll add recovery, that were different than other tornadoes, and what challenges were similar to other tornadoes? And any of the panelists are welcome to respond.
Well, I guess I'll go. I was waiting for the others to see. Of course, you heard some of my comments. You know, the challenge is, you know, for us, it's the breadth, you know, the geographic breadth of this. And one thing we may look and watch going forward is will we see more outbreaks like this and tornadoes on the ground as long as this one was? You know, for us with our other tornadoes in Kentucky, you know, we've had outbreaks across counties before, but nothing with the level of small communities that were completely destroyed in this one. So I think the challenge is getting a handle about what's needed, where and when, and how fast we can get resources, and pulling in the resources to respond as quickly as we can where we're needed.
Great. And let me see if I can sneak in one more from Michael. And this question might apply to Dave's work as well. Has there been any consideration at the state or local level during recovery to implement new building codes or other push mechanisms to increase community resilience?
So I'm not aware of at the state or local level yet. However, I will say that there has been some momentum building under the International Code Council, more at a higher level, is open to discussing this, has had some discussions lately about how to, you know, better incorporate tornado resilience into the building codes and wanting to move forward on that. So I'm not specifically aware for Kentucky itself, but I do know there's a series of workshops and so on that are being planned coming up in the next couple of weeks with representatives from all over, but including the Code Council, about how we can move forward and do better. So there is some positive momentum there.
And I wanted to add in, it's a great idea, but if you wait for the recovery time to start thinking of it, it's probably too late. That's one of the reasons that we encourage recovery planning from the EN side, but just to have the setup, because if you wait until my house is destroyed to say, let's discuss how we rebuild that community, as we've seen Katrina, Tuscaloosa, other areas, so compared to Joplin, that it's very difficult to do that when I don't have a house. So great point.
And if I could add one quick thing to that too, it's interesting for us, you know, everybody wants the plans, the recovery after actions from Joplin and Tuscaloosa and Greensburg and all, but you're right. I mean, we need to do that now, not afterwards. The challenge we have is to do what we can to be safe now, you know, because people do want to go back and start building back. So we don't want it to be too soon. It's still, well, slow down enough to let's do it better, stronger. I will also add that something significant for us in Kentucky, in this particular area, especially in Western Kentucky, those of you who are familiar with the New Madrid earthquake zone, we are in the heart of New Madrid, you know, the earthquake. And so I think we have an opportunity in Kentucky, not only to think about wind, but we have to think about that earthquake and building back now with earthquake standards.
Well, with this group, I think that we could probably talk about this topic all day, but we are coming up towards the end of our hour. So I'd like to, on behalf of our team, express our sincere thanks to all of our speakers today for sharing your expertise and your experience with this event. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of your day to attend our third Thursday on the fourth Thursday of the month. I will give Carl.
Lily, can I end with one funny thing with this? I'm
Sure.
Sorry, y'all are going to love this. I mean, I just saw that note in chat, and I forgot to mention this before about the December 10th. And what I wanted to say about this is this is great. You're going to love this. You know, one of the challenges we have, you hear about donations, challenges, water, clothing, things you don't need. But when you come 2 weeks before Christmas, toys become a great challenge. You know, it's just, we have warehouses filled with toys because, you know, they wanted to get that. But here's the funny part. I want to leave with you all. If you can imagine what I had to face. Then all these guys want to dress up as Santa Claus and come give out those toys and meet all the kids. We had Santa Claus fights. Seriously, they were ready to fight each other in costume, saying who gets to give out toys where. So there you go. That's a new disaster thing. Santa Claus wanting to fight.
That's the disaster after the disaster, as they might say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupt you, but I had to say that about Santa Claus.
No worries. Thank you for sharing.
Santa Claus.
I want to give Carl the last word, but just before we close, please save the date for our March 3rd Thursday on the 17th. And we're going to be sharing highlights from the Transportation Research Board and spotlighting Professor Suan Shen, Dingyi Liu, and Sequoia Riley for their presentations on adaptation to sea level rise, as well as green infrastructure solutions for transportation resilience. I will post the link to register in the chat and then pass it to Carl for some closing words.
Well, I want to thank you all for great presentations. I think they're really valuable lessons to be learned, and I hope that you will continue to share your experiences and your knowledge and your ideas and suggestions for improvements in building codes, improvements in tactics for managing the recovery. As we all know, these types of events are likely to keep occurring, and there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. And so I hope that you can continue to help us in terms of cataloging and identifying the best practices, the ideas, and the big takeaways that we can incorporate into our training and capacity building. So once again, thank you all. Thanks to everyone for joining us.